Toa. Welcome to the Climate Action Joint Committee. We have some potential new members coming today. However, they maybe haven't arrived yet. So if they do, we'll do a different welcome there. So we'll hand over to Te Rangiho from the senior Māori advisor from HBRC to lead us in a karakia.
Kia ora tātou. I begin bow our heads. Kūrata matunu te rani tēnei mātou e tuku whakamuimi te tēnei ki a koe mua au mana ki tana katoa kuru hia koe ki runi a mātou. Au tirai tēnei wā ka tuku ino ia tura ki a koe kia aratakina koe ia mātou tēnei o mātou hui huinga. Kia tutuki ai tēnei hui runi te aroha. Te rangi Māori e me te māramatanga hoki ki nā kaupapa ka hora nei ki mui a mātou i tēnei rā. Our dearest Father in heaven, we humbly thank Thee for the many blessings we receive on a daily basis, and are grateful for this opportunity to meet here today with the Climate Action Joint Committee, and we are grateful for the many gifts and talents and skills that have been brought to bear for this kaupapa. We ask Thee for Thy guidance during this hui, and to bless us to be able to work through those things that are going to help us in our region. We are grateful once again, Father in heaven, for the many blessings we receive, and ask Thee to open this meeting in the sacred name of our Lord and Saviour, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Kia ora tātou.
Thanks, Te Rangiho.
The machine is solved.
Yeah. Oh, starting to see. Right. Do we have a list of the apologies?
Based on the apology that I've received with Councillor Thomas.
Okay. So we have apologies from Councillor Deputy Mayor Brosnan from Napier City Council, Anne Redstone from Hastings District Council, Councillor Thomas from Wairoa, and did you have another?
Councillor Aitken is just going to be a little bit late. He's on his way.
Okay. Apologies for lateness from Councillor Aitken. And that seems a lot. Can I have a mover for the apologies? We're light on the ground. All right. Moved by Mayor Walker and seconded by Councillor Harding. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Okay. Do we have any conflicts of interest? There being none, move on to confirmations of the minutes. So, minutes from the last committee meeting. Can I have mover and seconder?
Move.
We're going to move Councillor Harding. Second, Mayor Walker. Any discussion? No. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Okay, our first paper is on the terms of reference. To set the scene for this meeting, we're going to ratify our terms of reference and then have a presentation from the Climate Change Commission. And then we're going to move into workshop and do some more planning and organising as a committee and have some education spaces after that. Right, so the first paper is the terms of reference. So as background, we brought that to the last committee meeting. It's gone out to all of the councils. They've had a good chance to have a look at it and go through their meeting processes. Did anyone want to speak to the paper? Or?
Desiree is happy to speak to it, take questions. Tēnā koutou katoa, members. I'm Desiree Cowell, Strategy and Governance Manager here at HBRC. I don't have too much more to add on the paper. you will remember when it came to the first meeting of the Joint Committee on the 22nd of May, you considered it and some changes were requested. The most substantive change was to the membership, and it was proposed to have up to 2 members of the Māori Committee and up to 2 members of the Regional Planning Committee, Tangata Whenua reps, and that was changed to be an invitation to all post-treaty settlement groups to appoint a member and an alternate. And I think we've had, Alison, can you confirm the membership?
We've had no formal responses at this stage. We've been advised that Michelle McElroy is a formal appointee, but we don't have formal paperwork for that.
So Michelle represents Tātou Tātou in Wairoa. So we will keep progressing that for the next meeting. And just Central Hawke's Bay District Council to consider adopt the terms of reference, and I believe that's happening this month. So
Thursday,
this week.
next week. No, 2 weeks away. Yes, just purely because of timing of meetings, Central Hawke's Bay District Council hasn't confirmed they've accepted the terms of reference yet, but we're comfortable that they've got to where we needed them to get to, and I think it's just timing. So I'm certainly happy to support that we move forward with these terms of reference how they are.
Brilliant. And they are, to a certain extent, a living document anyway, so if there is any changes that should come back in the next couple of months as we sort of form, that shouldn't be a problem. Is there any further questions? Oh, Denise.
Kia ora all. Hey, can I just have a confirmation that the Wairoa District Council has not yet advised of any appointments for the technical advisory group? Have they not done that yet?
No.
Okay, so I'll follow that up, Alison, and ask them to get those names to you.
Brilliant, thank you, Denise. Okay, if there's no further questions or discussion, I'll put the motion, which is that we receive and consider the Climate Action Joint Committee Terms of Reference update and accept the terms of reference as adopted by the partner councils. Can I have a mover and a seconder? Thank you, Mayor Walker. Second by Councillor Harding. Any further discussion?
I'm happy to just observe and seconding it that the quorum system is working. We have 7 out of 12, so I had to do a bit of a rapid count.
Yeah.
So there's slightly sparse on the table, so we are officially in action. So the terms of reference are working. I'm happy to.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried.
Madam Chair, can I just make a comment? I am concerned that our mana whenua representatives are not around the table, and I think that's important that that is noted, and that we take whatever action we can to ensure that they join with us.
Yes.
Well, happy to follow that up, and I think it's not been for a matter of not wanting to, it's been the amount of pressure on people's time at the moment. So I think hence workshopping some of the material today rather than having it formally come to the committee until we can get those numbers around the table.
Did you have a comment, Councillor?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just to, I just want to point out that it's not for want of effort, prioritisation on the part of Pippa and the other staff, Pippa and Desiree. So, it's just a fact of the life that we're, the post-cyclone life that we are at, I think. There's willingness on all sides and plenty of effort going on. So.
Yes, lots of conflicting priorities out there at the moment. But yeah, we do want to make a concerted effort to make sure that they're at the table. And some of the items in the workshop will cover off on that. Right.
Climate Change Commission are coming online at 1:30, so we've...
Well, have you heard any news there, Alison?
I haven't heard anything.
Okay. Right, so we're a little bit ahead of schedule. How about we break and then wait
I
for
think break for the climate, and for the Climate Change Commission would be a good way of doing it. Sorry, they're not available till 1:30, so
That's okay.
gone a little bit faster
Yeah,
than you
so
imagined.
if we break, we'll go offline and we'll let the community know what time we're going to come back online for that presentation.
So my suggestion, Chair, come back online at 1:25 and they'll be ready at 1:30 then for the presentation.
Sounds good. Okay.
Do you need somebody to move an adjournment?
Yes.
Happy to move an adjournment?
Thank you, Councillor
I'll
Kirk.
second.
Thank you, Mayor Walker. All those in favour?
Aye.
Against? Carried.
Pippa, just to introduce this presentation from the Climate Change Commission, and Chris, thank you very much for joining us. I guess it's a really pivotal, not only with what we see in front of us and have recently experienced with climate change events, but obviously as we head into the general election and the subsequent policies around climate change that we'll see. And it's great to have the Climate Change Commission as a non-political body up and giving us your critical advice. So look forward to hearing what you've got to say. Pippa, do you have anything else to add to that?
No, just to introduce Chris Holland as a principal analyst from the Commission, and Chris has got a lot of experience in setting those targets at a national level and giving that draft advice to the government that they have recently released their draft advice for this year for the next emissions reduction plan. And so we thought it might be useful for him to come and speak with you and give you some context around how we might start thinking about regionalising some of these national actions. So thanks, Chris. Over to you.
Yeah, kia ora koutou, ko Chris Holland aho. As Pippa said, I'm a principal analyst here at the Climate Change Commission, He Pouarangi. And so I believe you have a presentation which I shared previously, and so I don't know if you'd like to be able to share that, then I can talk through. As Pippa says, that really talks through the context for how national climate change targets, the national climate change targets we have been set, and gives a kind of thoughts around what that might mean for the region. If it's easier, I can share from this end, if that would be.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be helpful, Chris.
Okay, we have the technology. Well, I say that, but we'll see how we get on. I hope you can.
Yep.
Well done.
There we go. Okay, so hopefully you can see my slides. Oh no, you can't see. You can now see my slides there. Sorry. So the joy of presenting things online is now I can't see my notes, but I will know them close enough that we'll get through it with things. So to give a bit of context around He Pouarangi, so the Climate Change Commission, we were established, as you were mentioning, as a kind of non-political or apolitical body, as an arm's length agency of government back in 2019 to provide evidence-based advice to government on climate change issues. And what's, I think, really important is that we've been set up with this very long-term goal of achieving these 2050 emissions reduction targets in mind, and so that we have, a very long-term, almost intergenerational view of climate change, rather than thinking around the kind of more immediate kind of focus, which is often the case for government. We have a number of statutory roles. Firstly, kind of to review the 2050 emissions reduction target, periodically, and to understand if there have been changes have occurred since that target was set that we should be considered, to advise on the level of emissions budgets, and I can talk a little bit more about what those are, to advise on the policy to meet those budgets, so these are kind of stepping stones to meeting that 2050 target, to assess the kind of annual progress that government is making in setting those targets and achieving emissions reductions. We also give advice on some of the settings related to the emissions trading system, so thinking about things like the price limits and auction volumes which go into that system, so very important in terms of determining the kind of ambition of that system. We also have two roles in relation to adaptation as well. So these are roles which we are just about starting our work on, because the sequencing of deliverables has meant that our focus so far has been on mitigation. But the first is to prepare national climate change risk assessments. So looking at the risks of climate change and thinking about where those risks are, and then to monitor the government's progress in responding to those risks in setting out a national adaptation plan. I think it's also important to kind of recognise, as the Commission, we have to consider a really wide range of factors when giving our advice. So we have a broad range of factors related to economic, social, environmental circumstances, and also have to consider the Crown-Maori relationship, a Te Ao Māori approach and worldview, and the particular impacts on iwi and Māori as we consider our work. So to give some context for the targets which have been set at a national level. So these were set back in 2019 as part of the Zero Carbon Amendments to the Climate Change Response Act. So you might remember there was lots of discussion about the Zero Carbon Bill around that time. And I think what's important is that this is really a chance to update our legislation to respond to the requirements and the obligations that we agreed to under the Paris Agreements back in 2016, 2017. So firstly, it set out for the first time that the purpose of the Act is for New Zealand to contribute to global efforts to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and that's the highest ambition that we see in the Paris Agreement. It set out a new 2050 emissions reduction target and a process for that to be reviewed. It established that system of emissions budgets, which I mentioned, which are essentially 5-year caps, setting out stepping stones to get to that 2050 target. And it also established that new regime for climate adaptation I mentioned, and us as an independent voice to provide evidence-based analysis to support those decisions. So these are the targets which have been set. So by 2050, starting on the right-hand side, we have to reduce biogenic methane by at least 10% below 2017 levels by 2030, and between 24 and 47% below by 2050. And so we also have a split approach to this target because we also have those other gases. So this is mainly carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. They have to reduce to net zero by 2050. So what that means is that any remaining emissions of those gases have to be balanced out by removals of equivalent removals of those gases by things like either forestry or potentially in the future kind of engineered removals such as carbon capture and storage or carbon capture and use. So that means that by 2050 we need to effectively have stopped those gases being emitted on a net basis. So I think the important things to note about this is the separation of biogenic methane from other greenhouse gases, which I think is really important, reflecting that biogenic methane has a very different properties in the atmosphere to other greenhouse gases, has a relatively short lifetime in the atmosphere, but while it is there, it causes, it does have a large warming effect. I think biogenic methane is very different from fossil methane, from gas and oil, from those sources, and so reflects the kind of different nature of different properties of that gas in the atmosphere. The second thing to note is that we need to get those gases of, those long-lived gases down to zero. And those gases are going to be in the atmosphere when we emit long-lived gases like carbon dioxide or nitrous oxide. They're in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. And so it's important that when we look to get those gases to zero, we also consider the fact that by 2050, we need to get to a point where we're continuing to offset any remaining emissions. And I think that's really important when we look at this target, is it's not just a point in time target, it's by 2050 and every year beyond. And that really makes a big difference to how we think about the mix between reducing gross emissions of these gases and balancing that out by increasing removals. So there are some pathways which get us to net zero in 2050, which could mean that emissions after 2050 start to return to the positive. And so that's been really important in our thinking as a commission, is thinking about how do we set ourselves up for a transition to get to net zero by 2050 in a way which ensures that we can sustain that net zero position and potentially go further if the science says that we need to. So just to kind of show you where our greenhouse gases at the moment, this chart is separated in two sides, reflecting that split gas nature of that target. So on the right-hand side, we've got the biogenic methane, and as you'd expect, the majority of that is coming from agriculture, but there is a small proportion, around 10%, comes from waste, and so kind of solid waste treatment, and also wastewater treatment. It's important to note that we kind of, in our analysis as a commission, we separate these two sides of the target. And so we don't need to really concern ourselves with converting between them using metrics, which is often a kind of source of contention. So we have to reduce both of these gases by different amounts. And so for the biogenic methane, we're looking to reduce by 24 to 47%. And so you can see that there's potential there for reductions from waste, but also that there's going to have to be reductions from agriculture to achieve that target. On the long-lived gas side, you can see that the mix is between transport emissions, which is about 13 million tonnes a year, energy and industry, which is around 21 million tonnes a year. There's also some longer-lived greenhouse gases from agriculture, and that's mainly nitrous oxide emissions from manure manure management. And then there's a small amount of other greenhouse gases from waste and F gases, which are things like refrigerants, which have a kind of particularly potent effect on warming. Just moving on to those emissions budgets, and so this is the one area of our advice or analysis where we do combine both sides of that 2050 target. I wanted to kind of give you a sense of the size of the scale of the change which is required. So those first three budgets, which are the black lines on the left-hand bars, have been set by the government, and you can see that those are trending down over time, and those have to get to align with the red box, which is on the right-hand side, which I've added to this chart, which shows that range of methane by 2050 that we're aiming for. I think it's important to note that in the first emissions budget, we're not reducing emissions much below where they would otherwise have been. And I think that's often, I think that reflects the fact that it takes time for emissions policies to take effect and for some actions to diffuse across different sectors. So even though the emissions reductions in the first budget may appear very small, they're still laying the groundwork for further reductions in the second and third budgets. I hope this chart comes out clearly. What I wanted to do is give you a little sense of the kinds of changes that we expect. So in thinking about those pathways to 2050, what are the changes? What are the different things which are happening which are going to get us to that target? I haven't shown the budgets here, but what I've shown is three columns. The one on the left is the current emissions when we did this piece of advice a couple of years ago, so that's 2019. The current policy reference, which is kind of what we thought government policy at the time would deliver in terms of emissions reductions. And then I've shown our tailwind scenario, which is one of many scenarios we looked at, which looked at different ways we could get to 2050. And so what this shows is that for that stack of emissions above the line, there can be some quite significant changes to reduce gross emissions. Mainly that's coming from transport. You can see that blue box is reducing from where it is today. And by 2050, we think that if the conditions were right and government policy was supportive, transport emissions could get to almost zero by 2050. There might be some remaining emissions from things like off-road transport and heavy machinery, which might be much harder to decarbonise. But essentially, transport is, there are feasible technology options there to decarbonise transport. We also see really big savings in the energy industry and building space. That's partly through building more renewable energy and electricity sources such as solar and wind. But it's also through electrification of some of those other processes. So thinking about improving the efficiency of buildings and the way we heat them, and also thinking about switching away from coal and gas for things like process heats, thinking about things like milk powder drying, other sources of industrial heat use. You can see also that those green bars, that green bar does reduce over time. That's the nitrous oxide from agriculture, but it will be really dependent on whether we can get some kind of breakthrough technology to reduce those emissions much further. The other side of this is looking at the size of the removals. And so you can see under the current policy reference at the time, the government projected a kind of big increase in removals of carbon from forests, so a big uptick in planting. And as part of our scenarios, we also looked at the role of native forests in getting to net zero. So I think it's important in our advice, we stress that there are a kind of range of benefits that native forests provide. So that's things like soil erosion prevention, biodiversity support, and there's an opportunity here for us to plant native forests in order to produce not only remove carbon, but remove carbon in a way which is ongoing over the hundreds of years it will take for those forests to mature. On the biogenic methane side, it's the same three scenarios, and you can see here that the tailwinds scenario really goes much further, and that's really a world where we get the breakthrough technologies that we've been hoping for methane. So that's things like methane inhibitors or methane vaccines for ruminant animals. And it's really critical that those things are researched and developed in order to kind of achieve the upper end of that 24 to 47% reduction. The other thing I'd note is you can see that waste emissions in these scenarios really reduces by a large proportion. I think that reflects the fact that we believe that there's kind of good opportunities to reduce waste emissions from things like biogenic waste and wood going not into landfills but into other disposal routes to avoid those decomposing into methane. So just thinking about your task that you've set yourself and thinking about kind of some of that context and what that might mean. I think these are some reflections that I had on those pathways and how you might think about it. So I suppose the first point I'd make is that so it's expected that some regions can reduce emissions more than others, and I'm not expecting that the transition will look the same across every region. Regions will be different in terms of their mix of different activities, industrial location, things like that. So it's important to think not just about how do you reduce the emissions that are in your region, but also how can your region best contribute to meeting those national targets. And what role does your region potentially have to play in terms of meeting that 2050 goal? The second point I'd make is, like a lot of these emissions reductions will be encouraged by national level policy, and that might be emissions pricing policy, or it might be other policies which governments of the day choose to implement. And I think then it's important to think about what are the other factors that you can influence in your region which can help support and enable those policies to help reduce emissions. And the third point I'd make is to kind of consider the mix of biogenic methane, gross emissions of other gases, and carbon dioxide removals by forests. Because that mix of those three is really important, both in terms of the scientific understanding of the kind of warming impact of that pathway, but also the implications of that. And I think what's important is to think about the desired outcome that you're seeking to achieve by setting a target, so that you can make sure that the policies and actions that you put in place are driving towards an outcome that is preferred. So I've summarised a hefty 400-page document and a supporting 1,000-page document in 10-15 minutes. So I just encourage you to look some more at some of those advice that we've given to government, both the first advice in I-29, which set out our advice on emissions budgets, and as Pippa mentioned, the more recent advice we've given to government around the direction of policy for the second emissions reduction plan. And as always, we are really open to your questions and inquiries. So our email address is always open and always responded to. So hello@climatecommission.gov.nz. Thank you very much.
Kia ora, thank you for that, Christopher. Do we have any questions? Councillor Atkin.
Christopher, interesting, and there's a couple of concerns I have, the 20% to 24% to 47% methane reductions. Why haven't we not set at a figure what that reduction is? And the second question I've got is, I'm always in this whole climate change adaptation, climate change reduction, methane. What is the cost of this program? What's it costing us, and what is the effect it's going to have on our community? And I say that because Hawke's Bay's in a fairly serious situation at the moment after Gabrielle and Hale, and I think we're struggling to pay a lot of our repair bills, and I'm always conscious that when we come with these new, not so much new ideas, but this is what is actually costing us? What is it costing the community? What is your budget you believe it's going to cost us? And with forestry going in, and what's that going to have the effect on our communities and the rural communities?
Yeah, let me take the first question on the range for methane. So that range was set by Parliament, I think that was something which I wasn't privy to much of the back office wrangling, but that was something which Parliament agreed on that range, and it's something that we as a Commission can advise on. If we think that there's been a significant change in the evidence since that target was set. That 24 to 47% comes from the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees. And so that was the range globally to reduce biogenic methane for pathways to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees and avoiding kind of overshoot. So achieve, pathways which go above 1.5 degrees and then kind of go back down. So it's a source of uncertainty for us in terms of advising. Like, where do you advise on that? In that first piece of advice we gave around setting the budgets, we actually advised budgets which would put us more towards the 24% range, and that's essentially because we think achieving much deeper emissions reductions from methane would require some of those breakthrough technologies which we don't have confidence yet are going to be commercially available for farmers. It's something we're reviewing as we give our advice on the next set of emissions budgets, which will be next year. To come to your question on kind of what's the cost of this, so my background is as an economist here at the Commission. There are different ways to look at it. And so when we've looked at it at the kind of overall impact on the size of the economy, it makes about a 1% difference by 2050. So that's saying that we're projected to increase our GDP by about 73% under baseline, and we think it would be 72% higher in 2050 if we take these actions to reduce emissions. Now, that having been said, there are lots of areas where even though the overall impact on GDP might be relatively small, those costs might have significant impact on different communities, and that's something that we definitely factor in as we do our analysis. So we definitely kind of consider the impact on different communities, and particularly on rural communities. One of the requirements of the legislation is that we factor in the impact on rural communities of land use and potential land use change. And so that's something that we definitely incorporate into our advice. Thank you.
I was sort of asking, what is the dollar figure right now? What are our dollar figures?
For what, sorry?
To implement these plans.
So I don't think we've put a dollar cost onto all of them. That's partly because the evidence isn't available. What I would say is that for some areas, we expect to see a direct cost reduction from undertaking some of these actions. So things like electric vehicles are a good example of that, where even though they have a higher upfront cost to purchase them, they offer lifetime savings from the running and use of them, in addition to the emissions reduction savings. So we haven't actually been able to put a dollar cost on that for the whole package of these emissions budgets.
Wouldn't you think that was one of the primary things we need to look at, is just what is it going to cost our communities going forward? We're in a financial crisis right now, and we've got a food crisis and everything else, and I would have thought that we would have a cost put on that at a figure.
So yeah, as I said, we costed the whole so that the Act specifies what we need to look at. We have costed the whole impact on the economy, and we've costed where evidence is available. We've been able to cost some of these areas, and we're looking to improve that the next time that we give our advice on emissions budgets.
I would like to see what the direct in cost on what it's costing for example, food going to someone's plate. How much effect does this carbon tax have on how much it's costing the general public to buy a cabbage, for example?
I suppose it's all a bit of a science, so isn't it, projecting costs into the future? So a bit more of an art than a science, rather. So, yeah. Councillor Harding, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Look, one is just an observation from a meeting I had last week, and then I'll come to a question. So a number of we regional councillors were lucky enough to meet with Scott Simpson last week, and you joined us as well, Hayley, Chair Hayley. And one of the many things that we discussed is, I believe, if he's not the shadow minister for the environment, he wouldn't be offended by that characterisation. Anyway, so we had wide-ranging conversations around climate response, and the point that he made as a representative of the National Party was that all the major parties are signed up to our to the national agenda that's guided by the Climate Change Commission around our high-level targets. Right. Mm-hmm. The difference is is at the margin how you get there. So it's policies, and there are political differences in how different parties, different parts of society see how the effects of these transitions should be apportioned and ameliorated via policy. So we are, as a country, committed to these headline goals. The only points of difference are how we get them and how we apportion in the most equitable fashion and how we get there. So I think from a long run point of view, Councillor Aiken, we should be able to provide you some satisfaction that there's plenty of room at the margins for debate and work and change around how we make the transition in Hawke's Bay, to take account of our community. So that was just an observation which I hope helps. Just a question, Chris, around climate change risk assessments. So I'm just interested to understand a little bit more about where that's at, but also in the context, and for us, in a post-cyclone context, where we're aware of some preliminary work done around quantifying the effect of, and we've had that presented to a previous one of our joint Climate Action Committee meetings around the incremental effect of climate change on our cyclone, but also looking around the world every day for the last few years around the growing signs of an accelerated impact of climate change. So I just wanted to know how, and we've had a Climate Change Commission for a couple of years now, so just want to know how you're thinking about that, please, and how you're going about these risk assessments.
Yeah, and I will have to kind of disappoint you somewhat in that my main area of work is on the emissions reduction side. I do know that the first climate change risk assessment, I understand, was undertaken by MFE before the Climate Change Commission was established, and that the next one, I believe, the Commission needs to advise on that sometime next year. I believe it's June next year. I know that we've going through a large period of kind of engagement early to understand what those risks are, and understand kind of what might have changed in the last few years. But beyond that, I'm afraid I don't have much visibility of that. But will be very happy to take that question back to the office and get an answer for you if that would be helpful.
Yes, that would be helpful, but also the timing that you've laid out is quite helpful in that there's been a bit of a gap. We haven't done it yet. We've got a lot of new information that will no doubt be fed in.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. And to your point, Zan, earlier, I believe that's the purpose of this committee, is to make sure that we put forward our response to climate change in a way that's equitable for all of our community. Michelle, I see you have your hand up. Have you got a question?
Hello, Chris. My question's around one of your slides there, scenarios for long-lived greenhouse gases, and then your comment on what was most noticeable, as has been with every other report I've ever seen, is that there was no reduction in agriculture. And then your comment following on that was dependent on breakthrough technology with like methane inhibitors and vaccines to reduce emissions as an option. So wouldn't it be better just to reduce the numbers? the emitters instead of trying to find a way through methane inhibitors or vaccines to reduce the emissions that they're making. That is just common sense. And the other part is, because when I looked at the carbon report, I think it was last year, and they did in each region and each district in Hawke's Bay, the highest emitter was, there was most of the dairy farms are down in Central Hawke's Bay, as opposed to Whitehall, which was in credit because of all our native and probably exotic. Not that I'm a fan of exotic. And that was the other thing, so on that scale there, you were going to, tackle that by increasing the big uptake on planting exotic versus native. Now, understanding the difference, everybody knows the difference between the exotic and the native and what the native does and how it absorbs the water, but hardly any, uptake on the native there. And all I need to say is look at all the debris that we are clearing away from the beaches at the moment, and the slash, and how much destruction that has impacted our communities. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything encouraging there really. It's like a lot of concentration on the other emitters, but the main issue isn't being addressed, and we're just wasting our time if we're not going to go there.
So I suppose to come to your first point around kind of reducing production or reducing output, we did look at kind of there's some evidence that there are some things that farmers could do which would might reduce their stocking rate somewhat, so reduce the number of animals, but because you've got lower costs from those animals and lower emissions, but might actually mean that they've got a more resilient and more profitable system. So there's some evidence that we've seen around that, and that was definitely part of the package of measures that we looked at to get agricultural emissions down. I suppose to come to a couple of points. One, I suppose the targets that we've been given by Parliament say we need to reduce biogenic methane, but we don't have to get it to zero. So there's kind of implicit in that bit of an understanding that those emissions are going to be hard to reduce. We did kind of, we've taken an approach in our advice really to say, how do we decarbonise the activities which are going on rather than look, to switch to other activities. And I think that's, where possible, if we can meet those emissions reductions targets, while still maintaining the output and the production and the kind of economic benefit that those activities provide, that's probably a good thing. But taking your point that there might be some other costs that we're not factoring in, or other impacts that we should.
Well, the environmental cost to the water because of how dairy industry degrades the quality of the water in Te Manawa Te Wai.
Yeah,
National
absolutely.
Fresh water policy, you're ignoring that completely.
Well, I suppose, we're kind of trying to look at our part of it, which is how do we meet these climate goals, assuming that, freshwater policy is put in place that manages the impacts on freshwater catchments and things about that. In terms of your second question about the role of native forests, it does look like a very small area of kind of emissions reductions relative to the exotic forests. But that in part reflects the fact that native forests, absorb carbon more slowly than exotic forests. So there's a large area of planting, a couple of 100,000 hectares we're expecting would be desirable, particularly on kind of land which is less productive on farms, which could be put into native forests. But as you kind of recognise, one of the challenges around that is those forests have to be normally established or areas fenced, which comes with cost, and then they're much slower to absorb carbon, and so there's less of a business case there to make it, even though it has all these other multiple benefits which we'd like to encourage. But it's definitely something that we see as a commission to be part of the solution for 2050.
What about all the slash though?
Yeah.
So we're living with that at the moment. And also, we don't want to convert all our lands into pine forest and Wairoa. It'll just,
No, absolutely.
I'm sure
I mean, in
Denise will
terms of
talk
the
about that.
slash
I'll
is an
leave it to
interesting
you.
one because we actually looked at that and said, well, actually, that slash, that lots of that, it should actually be a source of revenue and should be something we used for biofuels. And part of that kind of switching away from other sources of emissions comes from using that slash more, rather than leaving it in place, collecting it and using it as a source of bioenergy.
Pellets.
But we've got to, but that takes policy to encourage that and to grow the supply chains.
Okay.
Cool, thank you.
Someone in 17.
Thank you for your points, Michelle. And I think to maybe put your mind at ease, like we're going to go into some workshops and some planning after this, and we get to look at how we want to do things in Hawke's Bay and how much of a holistic approach we want to take. So, yeah, we'll get your feedback in that session and hopefully see that through. Tanya Kerr, and then I see you've got your hand up, Denise. You'll go next.
Thanks, Chris. That was informative. I'm just wondering, are we also investigating new ways of absorbing carbon? For example, soil carbon. I've heard it spoken about in the past, but is there science happening at a government level?
Yeah, definitely there is, and I think there's a kind of range of ways that you could potentially absorb carbon, which could kind of complement the role of forests. And I think forests have a kind of really important role still, whatever path we choose. There will be a role for forests. In terms of soil carbon, my understanding is that much of the debate is around kind of how do we measure the soil carbon that's there, and there's some science going on to understand how do you improve the level of soil carbon over time. It's not at the stage, I understand, that it's possible to quantify that at a national scale in order to kind of implement it in terms of the policies that we would be advising government on. But it's definitely something where agencies like MPI are doing the science. There are other areas where we could absorb carbon. That could be things like restoring wetlands or peatlands, which would mean that those areas kind of reverse their kind of current process of releasing carbon as they kind of dry out. So there are definitely things that we are looking at in our advice in terms of other sources of emissions removals.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Denise?
Yeah, just a couple of suggestions really that in regards to the farmers. I think that if we could support them to develop best practice is really, because I wouldn't want to go on to a farmer and say, well, you need to reduce your stock by 200, whatever, because that's their income, that's their livelihood, and actually it adds to our GDP. So if we could look at ways to support farmers to come up with best practice, I think that's a better way forward there. The other one is in regards to the exotics. We need to manage that through our regional district plan that's going to be developed. But so it's a regional approach that supports the local approach. So for Wairoa, planting us in more pines is not probably the best thing. But I get your point that on land that's not suitable for anything else is where we should be looking. But we are going to be developing a regional district plan, and I think that if we take a regional approach with looking at the local solutions and local approaches, then we might come somewhere there. The other thing I just wanted to raise was, we used to have carless days. I don't know how much carbon they save, but how much that was worth it, but maybe that's something in the short term to bring back, and it might encourage a bit more walking and a bit more, well-being for whānau, for people. But I know that there used to be that, and it might have been a New Zealand thing, I'm not quite sure, but it's a thought that was an old practice that worked.
Yep.
it might work again.
Well, the equivalent of a carless day is a day at working from home like this, Zoom
yeah.
meetings.
From home,
So
yep.
that's the thing that's always interesting is that having worked on climate change for quite a while, there are a lot of mitigations that I didn't think would be possible, which actually have kind of come along in the time I've been working. Electric vehicles were one of those things that we thought might not ever take off, and now people own them and people use them. In terms of the farmers, I completely take your point around. I wouldn't like to go on to somebody's farm and pretend I know anything about how their farm works or how to make it better. But what we did say in our advice is that government should support farmers, and that's things like extension services and information and support. A lot of that is already provided by, Beef and Lamb and Dairy NZ, but there's more that the government could be doing to help farmers, to learn from that best practice, and that brings water benefits as well as climate benefits. So yeah, I think those are really good points. In terms of the forests, yeah, I think we need to recognise that there's a role both for native forestry with that long-term emissions sink that is going to be drawing in carbon for hundreds of years, and essentially an investment in the next 4 or 5 generations. But there'll still be a bit of a role for those exotic forests. But it's about managing that. And I know the government is considering ways, in part in response to our advice, around how do you create different incentives for those carbon removals than you do for those emissions reductions.
I hate to say it, but the Greens probably didn't do us much favours when they didn't allow forestry to burn off their slash, etc., because now we're wearing it. And so it's about better management. But
yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for those points, and good to hear some optimism from someone who's watching the space, Chris. That's brilliant. And totally agree. I think we're going into a session next around how we want to work with our community, and I think where we're going to, I hope where we land is somewhere around that sort of helpful, supportive style rather than a punitive approach. Mayor Walker.
Kia ora, Chris. Nice to have you with us this afternoon, and thank you for that. I just want to zero in on, you gave 3 really good pieces of advice about if we're going to take your direction about how we set targets and what we need to do at a region. And one of them was about what actions can we directly influence? And I think that's going to be really important about how we move forward. One of the other things we need to think about is your second point is about the outcomes that we want and how we deal with mix of gases. So your targets that you've set in your plans are based on putting the data in a split gas approach, and you alluded to the challenges of kind of considering methane as equivalent carbon units as well. I'd be interested just if you could flesh that out a little bit for us, because we're going to have to think carefully about what direction we give to our staff and to our plan about how to approach that. So that challenge of turning into carbon equivalents and the strengths of considering the split gas, as 2 sets of targets and the 2 ways of presenting it. I'd be really interested if you could help us with that.
Yeah, I suppose it's a really good point. I suppose when I started working on climate a while back, and we were under the kind of Kyoto Protocol approach, we kind of bundled everything into one number. Kind of long-lived gases and the biogenic methane all got combined in there, and we kind of we were fairly indifferent between the kind of reducing real emissions versus increasing the amount of offsets that you had. And I think as we've kind of, in part response to the Paris Agreement, in part to kind of realizing that the planetary boundaries which we need to kind of keep within to stay below 1.5 are kind of coming into view. We recognise that actually the mix of those 3 things, long-lived greenhouse gases, which we know have to get to 0 to avoid further warming, the removals by forests, and understanding that New Zealand is in a very unique position in that it has an opportunity to offset potentially all of its emissions through forestry, which is not a route which other developed countries would be able to take. and kind of how much do you reduce those gross emissions of biogenic methane. So I think what's been really interesting is seeing the debate really focus on what matters for the climate, and having a split gas approach, allows you to specify more clearly the outcome that you want in terms of the mix between those three things. So I think it's an interesting thought for you as a regional council in terms of how much it would be helpful to do that. It adds complexity in terms of communicating those changes, but being specific often helps you to be more targeted in terms of the actions you're taking, to make sure that you're actually taking taking steps in the right direction to achieve that target.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And in fact, the one part of our carbon profile that's decreasing in Hawke's Bay is the contribution of biogenic methane. Numbers of stock in this region are decreasing, and it's the only part of carbon contribution that is decreasing. And so that's the basis that we're working on now. And I think the interesting thing for us in the regional context is if you look at where the biogenic methane contributions are coming from, they are also the place where offsets through tree planting are coming from. But in the balance of how we look at whether we're getting to net emissions, they're not traded off against each other. And so there's a really interesting perspective for a primary sector food producing exporter like Hawke's Bay to get our heads around in the optics and the practicalities of which actions to take when the offsets in the target setting that's led by the government and through ETS actually are contra to how our industries may think. So it's going to be an interesting one for us to work through.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think being able to focus on those different baskets of gases allows you to think about what's the pathway that you want to set out, and what's the distribution of those impacts across different parts of your communities.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now, I'm just conscious of Chris's time here. Is it a question or is it more discussion, Zan?
Yeah, there was a question I wanted to ask, but just to follow on from Mayor Walker's comments and just to offer a little bit of hope, I guess, from a regional council point of view. One of our cornerstone programs is the Land for Life program, which we are looking at as becoming the centrepiece for our hill country response. And for Chris's benefit, our regional climate footprint looks something like 60% farming, which is mainly methane, 20% transport, 10% stationary energy. So if we're looking at our top three, then we have to be engaging with all of those, including farming, and that's even before we get to the conversations around offsets. But our cyclone has demonstrated to us very clearly what we already knew in terms of the importance of keeping soil on our hillsides. And so we have a great opportunity to actually have a really wonderful conversation around our hill country farming and the strategic use of trees on there that serve multiple functions. So they will serve a climate function, a profitability function for the farmers concerned if we get it right, and if the ETS settings are right, and I'm coming to this in a minute, which is my question, and fresh water as well. So we actually have the tools in front of us in Hawke's Bay already, and this committee, amongst others, gives us the vehicle to have really great community conversations about it, whilst tailoring our climate response to what suits our region. Getting to my question for Chris, and it's a really important one around biodiversity and the advice that the Climate Change Commission may be providing in to government around ETS settings. If we want to get reforestation in Hawke's Bay around natives, which we do to meet the aspirations of tangata whenua to have the most stable soils in appropriate places, we need really good ETS settings. That's the cold hard reality of it. And the key to that seems to be settings around biodiversity credits. Can you offer us any hope or advice on that, please, Chris?
Yeah, I have to say again that this is not my area of expertise, but I know that we've given advice around the ETS, and recognising that there are other benefits from native forestry in addition to carbon sequestration. I think that there's an open question for the government around whether it's better to try and incorporate payments of biodiversity into an emissions price, or whether to set up a separate policy for that. And I don't think we as a commission have had the mandate to look at that choice. But I think it's an open question about whether it would be more effective to be incorporating biodiversity as part of carbon and the ETS, or whether it would be better as a separate policy. But I know that's definitely something that our commissioners have thought of as we kind of give our advice around ETS settings and the kind of direction of the ETS to meet the kind of 2050 target.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. If I can just leave the thought and clearly imprinted in your mind that
Yep,
whether it's through the ETS or through a parallel process,
I think definitely recognise the need for biodiversity to be recognised and rewarded. Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, that's been a really good discussion on this, and thank you so much for your time, Christopher, and your knowledge that you've shared with us and the community. Looking for a mover of the recommendation that the Climate Action Joint Committee receives and notes the Climate Change Commission presentation. A mover, thank you, Deputy Mayor Kerr. Seconder, Councillor Harding.
Share it around.
Is there any further discussion? Done it well. Okay. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
All those against? Carried. That brings us to the conclusion of the formal part of our meeting, and we will close with a karakia. We welcome Te Rangahau to close us again, please.
Once again, thank you to Chris. Been very helpful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Kia ora tātou, tēnei te mihi atu ki a koutou. Ngā manuhiri, kua tau mai i runei te rorohiko i tēnei rā, o tira ki a tātou katoa. Me karakia tātou ki a mutu ai wa tātou mai i tēnei wāhanga o te hui. Bow our heads. He tō mātou matu anu i te rani tēnei mātou i tuku whakamoimitia tēnei ki a koe mo tō arahina pai a mātou i tēnei o mātou hui huinga. Me te inoe atu nō rā ki a koe, kia aratakina koe i a mātou. Mai tēnei wā a haere ake nei, i rutu i nā kōrero, ko timatahia, i nā marama ko ta hātu nei, ata noa mai ki tēnei wā. Hai āwhina rā i a mātou i tēnei rohe o te matau a Māui. Our dearest Father in heaven, we give thanks unto Thee for all the thoughts and the expertise that has been shared here during this hui, and we are grateful for the time that has been put into making this hui happen, and all the work that has been put into this mahi over the past weeks. We ask Thee to continue to watch over us and guide us as we move forward, as we understand and recognise that we are living in unprecedented times. And we're grateful for Thy guidance, grateful for the guidance of our leaders, and we ask Thee to bless them so that they may continue to ponder upon those things that we've heard this day, and to come up with ongoing solutions to the kaupapa that is before us at this time with climate change. And we ask Thee to close this part of our hui in the sacred name of our Lord and Saviour, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Kia ora.